The year was 1890, and the sun over Red Rock Crossing did not merely shine. It struck the earth with the weight of a blacksmith's hammer. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of dried sagebrush, horse sweat, and the metallic tang of heated iron. Red dust, fine as flour and persistent as sin, coated everything. It settled in the creases of men's necks, dulled the shine of the saloon windows, and crept into the lungs of every soul foolish enough to try and build a life in this corner of the territory. The town itself was an open wound in the desert landscape, a cluster of raw timber buildings and canvas tents that had sprung up overnight like weeds after a rainstorm. But there was no rain here, only the relentless wind that dragged the red sand across the wooden boardwalks. In the distance, the rhythmic, bone-jarring thud of the steam pile drivers echoed off the canyon walls. The railroad was coming. It was a steel serpent eating its way through the stone, bringing with it the promise of gold, the threat of civilization, and men who were hungry for both. Eleanor Pike stood on the porch of the Silver Spur Saloon, a dish rag twisted tightly in her hands. At 34 years of age, she was not an old woman by the reckoning of the civilized East, but here, where the sun aged skin like leather and the hard water stripped away softness, she felt the weight of every single year. She wore a dress of calico, faded to a nondescript gray, clean but frayed at the hem. It was the dress of a woman who worked for her keep. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was pulled back severely, though a few rebellious strands escaped to frame a face that held the ghost of a former beauty, now etched with the fine lines of fatigue around the eyes and mouth. She had been a schoolteacher once, 3 years ago, before the fever took her husband. She remembered the feeling of chalk on her fingers and the smell of old books. Now, her hands smelled of lye soap and onion skins. She was the sous chef, the server, and occasionally the target of a drunken miner's clumsy affection, though she rebuffed such advances with a cold, schoolmarmish stare that usually did the trick. Today, however, Eleanor was not thinking of the kitchen. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird in a cage. The noon train had just whistled, a mournful, shrieking sound that cut through the heat. Silas Boone was returning. The square in the center of town was already filling up. Men left their card games. Women in bonnets paused in their shopping. Silas Boone was not merely a man. He was the heartbeat of Red Rock Crossing's economy. A former military officer turned industrialist. He represented the mining combine and the railroad interests. He owned the land the saloon stood on, the bank that held the miners' wages, and, or so Eleanor had believed for the past 6 months, he held her future in his manicured hands. She smoothed her apron, her palms sweating. He had promised, before he left for the capital 2 months ago to secure the final permits for the canyon expansion. He had taken her hand in the parlor of the hotel. He had spoken of a house with glass windows, of a garden where she could grow roses instead of sage, of a life where she would never have to scrub another grease-stained plate. A safe life, he had called it, for a widow who had spent 3 years terrified of starvation. Safe was a word more seductive than love. The train hissed to a halt, steam billowing out to mix with the red dust. The heavy iron doors clanked open, and Silas Boone stepped onto the platform. He was a handsome man in the way a wolf is handsome. He wore a suit of dark, expensive broadcloth that seemed impervious to the dust, a silk vest, and a hat that cost more than a miner earned in 6 months. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a jawline that was sharp and decisive. He moved with the easy, predatory grace of a man who has never had to step aside for anyone. Sheriff Tom Cutler was the first to greet him, the lawman, a paunchy man with shifting eyes and a spine that seemed to bend too easily, practically bowed. "Welcome back, Mr. Boone," Cutler said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "The town has been waiting on you." Boone nodded, a tight, practiced smile touching his lips but never reaching his eyes. "Progress waits for no man, Sheriff, but it is good to be back." He stepped down from the platform, his polished boots hitting the dirt. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He walked toward the Silver Spur, likely looking for a drink to wash the train smoke from his throat. Eleanor stepped forward. She could not help herself. Hope is a dangerous thing, and it propelled her from the safety of the porch shadows into the harsh glare of the midday sun. "Silas," she said. Her voice was steady, though her knees shook. Boone stopped. The crowd went silent. Even the distant hammers seemed to pause. He turned slowly to look at her. For a moment, Eleanor saw a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a shadow of the affection he had feigned in the quiet of the parlor. But then his eyes shifted. He looked at her gray dress, her red, chapped hands, the lines around her eyes that the sun was mercilessly highlighting. Then he looked at the crowd watching him, the young miners, the wealthy investors he had brought with him from the city, the fresh-faced girls in their Sunday best. The calculation in his eyes was cold and absolute. "Mrs. Pike," he said. The formality was a slap in the face. Eleanor froze. "Silas, you said, when you returned—" Boone cut her off with a raising of his hand. It was a gesture one might use to silence a noisy dog. He took a step closer, not to be intimate, but to ensure his words carried the weight of a verdict. "I have had time to think. Eleanor," he said. His voice was smooth, the rich baritone of a gentleman, which made the cruelty of his words slice deeper. "You are a kind woman. You have been convenient company." A gasp rippled through the women in the crowd. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "But," Boone continued, raising his voice slightly so the investors behind him could hear, "I am a man building an empire. I require a legacy. I have made inquiries. Eleanor, people talk. They say you are past your prime." He let the words hang in the hot air. "They say you are too old," Boone said, his eyes boring into hers. "You are a widow of 3 years. You gave your husband no children. Dr. Evans has mentioned your delicate constitution. A man in my position needs a wife who can provide heirs. I need someone younger. Someone fruitful." The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken only by a snicker from a group of prostitutes leaning over the balcony of the saloon across the street. Then, a few of the miners chuckled, a low, ugly sound. The respectable women of the town, the ones who had looked down on Eleanor for working in a saloon, exchanged glances of vindictive triumph. Eleanor stood rooted to the spot. She felt as if he had stripped her naked in the town square. Her hands gripped the wooden railing of the porch so hard a splinter drove itself deep into her palm. But she did not feel the pain. She felt only the burning heat in her ears and the hollow, icy pit in her stomach. He had reduced her entire existence, her intellect, her struggle, her survival, to 2 things: her age and her womb. "I see," Eleanor whispered. She refused to cry. She would not give him that satisfaction. She lifted her chin, though it trembled. "I understand you perfectly, Mr. Boone." Boone nodded, dismissing her already. "I knew you would be sensible. Sheriff, buy the house around. We celebrate the future today." He swept past her, brushing against her shoulder as if she were a wooden post, and entered the Silver Spur. The crowd cheered, the promise of free whiskey washing away any lingering discomfort at the public humiliation of the cook. Eleanor remained on the porch. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "They decide what I am worth," she thought, the realization bitter as bile in her throat. "If I cannot bear a son, if my face has lines, I am nothing to them. Just a tool to be used and discarded when it loses its shine." She was not the only one who had watched the scene unfold. 30 yards away, in the shadow of the overhang of the post office, a man stood motionless. He was a part of the shadows, wrapped in a blanket of dark wool despite the heat. Tajinez was a warrior of the Dine, the people the whites called the Navajo. He was tall, his body lean and corded with muscle, his black hair pulled back and tied with a strip of leather. His face was a mask of stone, etched with the hard angles of the high desert. He had observed the entire exchange with eyes that were dark and unreadable. He saw the white man, the one who smelled of expensive soap and rotten ambition. crush the woman's spirit as easily as one might crush a beetle. Taji did not move to interfere. It was not his fight. In this world. The Bilagana, the white people, ate their own. They were like coyotes fighting over scraps. Why should he care if one white woman was cast aside by her own kind? Yet his gaze lingered on Eleanor. He saw the way she stood, straight back despite the blow she had just taken. He saw her hands clenched into fists, not in weakness, but in a desperate attempt to hold herself together. He knew something about dignity in the face of erasure. His people were being erased every day. The town of Red Rock Crossing was an encroachment. The Navajo had been pushed back, mile by mile, forced out of the fertile valley to the north to make way for the treks and the mines. Now, the rumors were swirling like dust devils that Boone intended to go further. They said the company wanted to blast a tunnel through the canyon of Red Echoes. To the white men, the canyon was just an obstacle of sandstone and granite. To the Dine, it was the throat of the earth, a holy place where the wind carried the voices of the ancestors. To destroy it was to silence the past. Taji pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. He was not here for the woman. He was here for the canyon. He slipped away from the post office, moving with a silence that was unnatural for a man of his size, and disappeared into the narrow, garbage-strewn alley behind the general store. The alley smelled of rotting vegetables and urine. A figure was waiting for him there, huddled behind a stack of empty crates. It was Hastian TSO, an older Navajo man who traded turquoise and silver with the tourists, and sometimes heard things he wasn't supposed to hear. "Did you get it?" Taji asked in his own tongue, his voice low and rough like grinding stones. Hastian TSO nodded nervously, his eyes darting to the mouth of the alley. "The layout is in the surveyor's office, inside the saloon, but Boone keeps the key to the strongbox on his person. They plan to use the new explosives, dynamite. Boxes of it arrived on the train with him. When? Soon. 2 days, maybe 3. They want to clear the pass before the investors leave." Taji looked toward the back wall of the Silver Spur. The saloon was roaring with noise now. The piano clinking out a jaunty tune. Men shouting toasts to Silas Boone. The enemy was inside, celebrating his power. "I need to know exactly where they will place the charges," Taji said. "If we strike blindly, they will just bring more men, more guns. We must stop the destruction, not just kill the workers." "It is dangerous, Taji," the old man whispered. "Boone has the sheriff in his pocket, and they say he has hired gunmen from Texas. The canyon is more dangerous than any gunman if you disrespect it." Taji replied, "Go. Return to the family. Tell them I am watching." Hastian TSO scurried away, leaving Taji alone in the shadows. He looked up at the second floor of the saloon. He could see a window, small and grimy. He wondered if that was where the woman lived, the one who was too old, inside the Silver Spur. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of spilled whiskey. Eleanor had returned to her duties because she had nowhere else to go. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, collecting empty glasses, wiping tables. She tried to make herself invisible, but the eyes of the town followed her. "Hey, Granny!" a miner shouted, grabbing her arm as she passed. "Boone don't want you, but I ain't so picky. How much for a smile?" The table erupted in laughter. Eleanor pulled her arm away, her skin crawling. "Let go of me," she said, her voice tight. "Leave her be, Jack." The barkeep, Mr. Clancy, shouted from behind the counter, but there was no kindness in his voice, only annoyance. He signaled Eleanor to the back. When she reached the relative safety of the kitchen, Clancy followed her. He was a man shaped like a barrel, with a red face and a heart that counted every penny. "Look here, Eleanor," he said, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. "I can't have you causing scenes out front. It's bad for business." "I caused no scene." "Mr. Clancy," Eleanor said, her hands shaking as she reached for a sack of potatoes. "He spoke to me. I answered." "You had ideas above your station, is what you had." Clancy grunted, thinking a man like Boone would marry the cook. "I told you, didn't I? I told you not to dream big." "I am a teacher," Eleanor said softly. "I was a teacher. "You are a widow with no money and gray in your hair," Clancy said brutally. "Boone is right. In his way, this is the West. Woman. A man wants a wife who can give him sons to work the mine. You're dried up." He pointed a thick finger at her. "You keep your head down. You work the kitchen. You accept your lot. You're lucky I keep you on at all. An old woman is just another mouth to feed if she ain't working." He turned and pushed back through the swinging doors, leaving Eleanor alone with the sacks of potatoes and the boiling pot of stew. She stood there for a long time, staring at the peeling skin of the potato in her hand. Dried up. The words echoed in her mind. Too old. She worked until her back ached and her fingers were raw. She worked until the sun went down and the lamps were lit in the saloon. She worked until the noise outside swelled into a cacophony of drunken revelry. Finally, when the kitchen was closed and the night was deep, Eleanor climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to her room in the attic. It was a small space, stiflingly hot during the day and freezing at night. There was a narrow cot, a wash basin with a cracked pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the back alley and the desert beyond. She did not light the lamp. Oil cost money, and she needed to save every penny now. She sat on the edge of the cot, still wearing her stained apron. Outside, the town of Red Rock Crossing was alive. The piano music drifted up through the floorboards, a mockery of cheerfulness. She could hear the shouts of men, the high-pitched laughter of the saloon girls, the clink of gold coins hitting the bar. It was the sound of a world that was moving forward, a world of iron and steam and money. And she had been told, in no uncertain terms, that she had no place in it. Eleanor looked at her hands in the moonlight. They were strong hands. They had chopped wood, carried water, nursed a dying husband, and taught children to read. But to Silas Boone, to Clancy, to the town, these hands were useless because they were not young. A tear finally escaped, hot and angry, tracking through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away furiously. "If I am too old here," she whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling in the darkness. "Is there any place left on this earth for me?" She looked out the window, beyond the lights of the town. The desert was a vast ocean of darkness. The wind howled softly, carrying the scent of sage and ancient stone. Somewhere out there were the Navajo, the people the town hated. Somewhere out there was the canyon Boone wanted to destroy. And somewhere out there, hidden in the black folds of the night, Taji Nez was watching the same moon, wondering if his world, too, was about to end. Eleanor did not know it yet, but the threads of her life, which she thought had been cut today, were being spun into a new loom. She thought her story was over, that she was just a footnote in the history of a great man's rise. But the night was long, and the desert had a way of changing things. The gold was in the ground. Yes, but the fire was coming. And as she sat there, alone and discarded, the first spark of a different kind of anger began to smolder in her chest. It was not the flash of gunpowder, but the slow, enduring heat of an ember buried deep in the ash, waiting for a breath of wind to roar into life. The grandfather clock in the hallway of the Silver Spur chimed 11 times. Each stroke was a heavy, dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, matching the throbbing ache in Eleanor Pike's feet. The saloon was quieter now than it had been at sunset, the rowdy chaos of the miners having settled into a murmuring, sullen stupor fueled by cheap rye and exhaustion. But the private room at the back, the one reserved for the men who owned the town rather than worked it, was still bright with lamp oil and loud with the clinking of crystal. Mr. Clancy had shoved a heavy brass tray into Eleanor's hands 5 minutes ago. It held a fresh bottle of Kentucky bourbon, 3 clean glasses, and a bowl of ice that was sweating rapidly in the stifling heat. "Take this to Boone's table." Clancy had grunted, not looking her in the eye. He had been avoiding her gaze ever since the incident on the porch that afternoon. Guilt, perhaps, or merely the discomfort of a man who knows he is complicit in cruelty but lacks the spine to object. "And keep your mouth shut. Eleanor, you have done enough damage to your reputation for one day." Eleanor did not argue. She adjusted her grip on the tray. feeling the cold condensation against her calloused palms, and walked down the narrow, dimly lit corridor that separated the kitchen from the private parlor. Her head was held high, but inside, she felt hollowed out. The humiliation from the afternoon had settled into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She was the woman who was too old, the woman who was barren, the woman who was nothing. She reached the heavy oak door of the private room. It was slightly ajar, latch failing to catch in the warped frame caused by the relentless dry heat. Voices drifted out, swirling with the blue smoke of expensive cigars. "The natives are a nuisance. Silas, nothing more," a voice said. It was smooth, oily, and belonged to Elias Thorne, the representative from the railroad company back east. "But the terrain, that is the real enemy. The engineers say the grade is too steep for the heavy locomotives." "Engineers lack imagination." Silas Boone's voice cut through the air, distinct and commanding. "They see stone and see a wall. I see stone and I see opportunity." Eleanor paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. She should have knocked and entered. But something in Boone's tone, a casual, terrifying disregard, froze her in place. "The Canyon of Red Echoes," Sheriff Tom Cutler mumbled, his voice thick with drink. "The Navajo say spirits live in those walls. Silas, they say if you break the rock, the sky will fall." Boone laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. "Superstition is the crutch of the weak. Tom, that canyon is the only direct route to the San Juan Basin. And, according to the assays I received yesterday, the quartz veins in those walls are thick with gold. Gold that the savages have been walking past for centuries without the wit to harvest." Eleanor pressed closer to the crack in the door. Through the haze of smoke, she could see the three men sitting around a mahogany table covered in maps and papers. Boone was leaning back in his chair, a cigar clamped between his teeth, looking every inch the conqueror. "We blow it," Boone said, tapping a spot on the large map spread out before them. "2 days from now, we set the charges at the base of the Spider Rock Formation. The landslide will clear the grade for the track and expose the vein simultaneously. 2 birds, 1 stone." "And the Navajo?" Thorne asked, swirling his drink. "There is a settlement near the entrance. They move, or they get buried," Boone replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "It is just dirt and savages. Elias, the railroad brings civilization. History does not stop for a few tents and some painted pottery. Anyone who stands in the way gets swept aside." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the ice on her tray. Dirt and savages. It was the same tone he had used when he looked at her on the porch. Too old, too barren, to Silas Boone. The world was divided into things he could use and things he could discard. People, mountains, promises, they were all the same to him. A gust of wind from an open window down the hall pushed the door open another inch. The movement went unnoticed by the men, but it gave Eleanor a clear view of the table, beside the map, which was marked with angry red crosses indicating dynamite placement, lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was open. Eleanor had a teacher's eyes. She was trained to read upside down from across a desk, even from this distance. The bold, looping handwriting was legible. She saw lists of names and numbers. Sheriff Cutler, $500. Lieutenant Gary, United States Cavalry, $1,000. Governor's aide, $2,000. It was a book of bribes. It was the proof that the law in this territory was bought and paid for by the mining combine. She realized with a jolt of terror that she was holding her breath. If they saw her now, if they knew she had seen the ledger, her life would be worth less than the whiskey on her tray. She stepped back, intending to retreat to the kitchen and claim she had dropped the bottle, anything to avoid entering that room. But as she turned, she collided with something hard and warm in the shadows of the hallway. A hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. The tray tipped. Eleanor, fueled by a surge of desperate adrenaline, caught the bottle of bourbon with her free hand before it could hit the floor. Though the ice rattled ominously in the bowl, she was pressed against the rough wooden wall. A pair of dark eyes stared into hers, inches away. It was the Navajo man, the one from the square, Taji Nez. He was silent as a shadow. In his right hand, he held a knife, a blade of chipped obsidian, sharp enough to split a hair. He held it low, not threatening her throat, but ready for a heartbeat. They stood frozen in the dim corridor. Eleanor could smell the scent of him: wood smoke, sage, and the dust of the high desert. He did not smell like the sour sweat and alcohol of the men in the saloon. Slowly, Taji removed his hand from her mouth. His eyes never leaving hers, he raised a finger to his lips. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the knife, then at the candle flickering in the wall sconce, and finally at the bottle in her hand. She could smash it over his head. She could scream. Sheriff Cutler was 10 feet away. But then she remembered Boone's voice. They move, or they get buried. She looked at Tazi. He was not looking at her with the predatory hunger of the miners, nor the dismissive contempt of the townsfolk. He was looking at her with a calm, intense assessment. He was an outsider in this house of timber and noise, just as she was an outsider in a town that valued her only for her youth. He signaled with his head toward the door of the private room. Then, he pantomimed a small square shape with his hands. The ledger. He knew. He was here for the proof. A wild, terrifying thought bloomed in Eleanor's mind. If she screamed, Tazi would be killed. Boone would blow up the canyon. The gold would flow into Boone's pockets, and he would buy more power, more land, and crush more people like her. "The window," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation from the room. Tazi frowned, tilting his head slightly. "The back window," she whispered, leaning closer, the heat of her anger at Boone overriding her fear of the warrior. "It is unlatched. I can open it wider. If I make a distraction, can you get the book?" Taji studied her face. He saw the fear there. Yes, but he also saw the set of her jaw. It was the look of someone who had been pushed too far. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Eleanor took a deep breath. She adjusted the bottle on the tray, smoothed her apron, and nodded back. She turned and kicked the door open with her foot, bustling into the room with a flustered energy she did not feel. Gentlemen, forgive the delay," she exclaimed, her voice pitched higher than usual. "The ice block was stubborn tonight." Boone looked up, annoyed. He threw a hand over the ledger, covering the open page. "You took your time, woman. Put it down and get out." "Of course, Mr. Boone, right away," Eleanor said. She moved to the table, positioning herself between the men in the dark corner near the back window. She set the tray down with a clatter. "Oh, my heavens, it is stifling in here," she said, wiping her brow. "Shall I open the window for a draft? The smoke is thick enough to cure a ham." "Leave it," Boone snapped. "Just a crack, sir, for the sheriff's sake," she insisted. And before Boone could stop her, she lunged for the heavy velvet curtains and threw them back. She unlatched the window and shoved it upward. The night air rushed in, flickering the lamps. "Woman." Boone stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I said leave it." "I am so clumsy," Eleanor cried out, and as she turned back, she deliberately hooked her elbow into the tall bottle of bourbon she had just placed on the table. The bottle toppled. Amber liquid splashed across the map, soaking the paper. "You stupid cow," Boone roared. He grabbed the map, trying to save it from the alcohol. Sheriff Cutler jumped up as the liquid dripped onto his trousers. Thorne swore loudly. In the chaos of cursing men and stained paper, the attention of the room was entirely focused on the table and the spilled whiskey. Eleanor shrank back against the wall, feigning horror. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." Behind Boone's back, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the window frame. Taji moved like smoke. He did not make a sound on the floorboards, while Boone was shaking the dripping map and cursing Eleanor's ancestors. Tazi's hand shot out. He grabbed the leather ledger. He grabbed the duplicate folded map that Thorne had left on the side table. He was turning to slip back out the window when the door to the hallway burst open. It was one of Boone's hired guns, a man named Stryker, coming to investigate the shouting. Stryker saw the open window. He saw the Indian, Navajo, Stryker yelled, his hand flying to the Colt on his hip. The room exploded into action. Tazi did not hesitate. He vaulted through the window, disappearing into the darkness of the alley. "Get him!" Boone screamed, dropping the soaked map. "He has the book, kill him!" Stryker fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. The bullet splintered the window frame, sending wood chips flying. Eleanor stood frozen. Boone turned to her, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked from the open window to Eleanor, and the realization dawned on him. "You!" he hissed. "You opened the window. You knocked the bottle." "It was an accident," Eleanor stammered, backing away. "Liar!" Boone lunged for her. Eleanor didn't think. She acted on instinct honed by a hard life. She threw the heavy brass serving tray at him. It struck Boone in the chest, staggering him just enough. She spun around and ran. "Stop her!" Boone bellowed. "She is with him! She is a traitor!" Eleanor sprinted down the hallway. She heard heavy boots pounding behind her. She burst through the swinging doors into the kitchen. Clancy looked up from his chopping block, his mouth falling open. "Eleanor, move!" she screamed, shoving past him. She knocked over a stack of pots and pans to create an obstacle and flew out the back door into the cool night air. The alley was chaos. She could hear shouting from the street. Horses were whinnying in panic. "This way!" a voice hissed. Taji was there, mounted on a paint horse that was dancing nervously in the dust. He had not left her. He held the ledger tucked into his belt. Eleanor stopped. Her chest was heaving. She looked back at the saloon. The back door banged open, and Stryker emerged, gun raised. Another shot rang out, kicking up dirt near her feet. "There she is!" Stryker yelled. "Shoot the witch!" Eleanor looked at the town she had tried so hard to be a part of. She saw the faces of the men spilling out of the saloon, men she had served, men she had taught, in the lamplight. Their faces were twisted with the thrill of the hunt. To them, she was no longer a woman. She was an enemy. She was a traitor who had sided with the savages. "You stand with the tribe, or you die with the whites," Taji said. His hand extended toward her. It was not a command, it was an offer. Eleanor looked at his hand. It was scarred and brown. It was the hand of a man who fought for what was his. Boone stepped out onto the back porch, his fine suit stained with bourbon. "I will hang you, Eleanor," he screamed. "I will see you rot." That voice, that entitlement, it snapped the last thread of hesitation in her soul. Eleanor grabbed Tazi's forearm, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She swung herself up behind him, straddling the horse's rump. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the rough wool of his blanket. "Go!" she commanded. Taji kicked the horse's flanks. The animal reared, pivoting on its hind legs, and surged forward. They galloped down the alley, the hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. More shots rang out, buzzing like angry hornets through the air around them. But the darkness was their shield. They burst out of the alley and onto the open scrubland at the edge of town. The wind roared in Eleanor's ears, tearing the pins from her hair. She felt the powerful muscles of the horse beneath her and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the warrior in front of her. Behind them, the lights of Red Rock Crossing began to fade, shrinking into insignificant specks of yellow against the vast, indifferent black of the desert. Eleanor did not look back. She pressed her cheek against Tazi's back and closed her eyes. She had lost her home. She had lost her reputation. She had lost the safety Boone had promised. But as the cool night air filled her lungs, she realized she had found something else. She was no longer waiting to be discarded. She was running. She was fighting. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Pike was alive. The horse ate up the miles, heading north toward the jagged silhouette of the mountains, toward the fire, toward the gold that no banker could count. The inciting incident was over. The war had begun. The desert night was not merely dark. It was a physical weight that pressed against the earth, cold and absolute. To Eleanor Pike, who had spent the last 3 years within the stifling, heated walls of the Silver Spur kitchen, the sudden drop in temperature was a shock to the system. The heat of the day had evaporated into the thin atmosphere the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a chill that bit through her thin calico dress and settled deep in her bones. She clung to Tazi's waist, her fingers numb and stiff. The horse, a sturdy paint with a rough gait, moved tirelessly beneath them, navigating a landscape Eleanor could barely see. Every stumble of the animal sent a jolt of pain up her spine. But she did not complain. She dared not. The memory of the gunshot and Silas Boone's enraged face was still too fresh, a hot brand in her mind that kept her silent and terrified. Tazi Nez said nothing. He was a solid wall of warmth in front of her, his back rigid, his attention entirely focused on the invisible path ahead. He rode without a saddle, guided only by a rope hackamore and the pressure of his knees. Eleanor felt the shift of his muscles with every movement of the horse, a reminder of the raw, untamed strength that she was now entirely dependent upon. They rode for what felt like hours, leaving the lights of Red Rock Crossing far behind until they were swallowed by the vast emptiness of the high plateau. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of hooves on hard-packed sand and the mournful, hollow sound of the wind rushing through the sagebrush. Finally, as the moon began its descent, Tazi slowed the horse. They had entered a narrow fissure in the earth, a slot canyon where the walls rose high and jagged on either side, blocking out the stars and cutting off the biting wind. "We stop here," Tazi said. His voice was low, rough from the dust and the silence. He slid off the horse with a fluid grace and turned to help her. Eleanor tried to dismount, but her legs crumpled beneath her. She would have fallen into the sand had Tazi not caught her by the elbow. His grip was firm, impersonal, yet it held her upright until the blood returned to her feet. "My apologies," Eleanor stammered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I am not used to riding." Tazi did not answer. He tethered the horse to a scrub oak and began to gather dried driftwood that had been washed into the canyon by old floods. He moved with an efficiency that fascinated Eleanor. Within minutes, he had struck a spark from a piece of flint, and a small, smokeless fire was crackling against the canyon wall. He gestured for her to sit. Eleanor collapsed near the warmth, holding her shaking hands out to the flames. The light illuminated Tazi's face, casting deep shadows in the hollows of his cheeks and emphasizing the sharp, aquiline nose. He looked at her across the fire, his dark eyes assessing, devoid of the lust or pity she was accustomed to seeing in white men. "You have the book?" he asked. Eleanor patted the pocket of her apron where the heavy leather ledger was weighed down. "I do. And the map." Tazi nodded slowly. He took a strip of dried meat from a pouch at his waist and offered it to her. Eleanor took it hesitantly. It was tough and salty, but she chewed it gratefully. "Why?" Tazi asked after a long silence. "You are Bilagana. White. Boone is your people. Why give me the book?" Eleanor swallowed the dry meat. She looked into the fire, seeing the image of herself standing on the porch, humiliated, stripped of her dignity. "Boone is not my people," she said, her voice gaining a surprising steadiness. "He thinks he owns the land. He thinks he owns the town. Today, he told me that because I cannot give him children, because I have lived 34 years. I am worth nothing. He called me barren. He called me old." She looked up, meeting Tazi's gaze directly. "I decided I would rather be a traitor to him than a traitor to my own soul. Is that reason enough?" Tazi studied her for a long moment. The suspicion in his eyes did not vanish, but it softened into something resembling curiosity. He had seen many white people lie, but he had rarely seen one stripped of their pretense. "The rarest gold comes through fire," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "What did you say?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing," Tazi replied. He stood and unrolled the thick wool blanket he had carried over his shoulder. He sat back down next to her, not touching, but close enough to share the heat. He draped the blanket so it covered both of their backs, creating a small tent of warmth against the canyon wall. "Sleep," he commanded. "The desert does not care about your soul. It only cares if you are strong enough to wake up." Eleanor stiffened at the proximity. She was a respectable widow. She had not sat this close to a man since her husband died. The scent of him, wood smoke, horse, and sage, was overwhelming. But the cold was a predator waiting in the dark, and his body heat was the only defense. Slowly, she relaxed, leaning slightly toward him until her shoulder brushed his arm. He did not pull away. She slept fitfully, waking to the sound of the wind changing its voice. It was no longer a whistle, but a roar. Morning did not bring the sun. It brought a wall of red. Eleanor woke to a sky that was a bruised purple and ochre. The air was thick and gritty. Tazi was already awake, securing the horse in a deeper recess of the canyon wall. He moved with urgency. "Cover your face," he shouted over the rising gale. "Sandstorm." Before Eleanor could fully comprehend, the storm hit. It was not rain. It was a solid assault of earth. The wind screamed down the canyon, carrying millions of particles of red sand that stung like needles. Visibility dropped to nothing. Taji scrambled back to her. He pulled her into the deepest crevice of the rock overhang. He threw the heavy wool blanket over their heads, pulling her down so they were crouched together in the dirt. There was no room for propriety now. Taji wrapped his arms around her, shielding her body with his own, pressing her face into his chest to protect her from the suffocating dust. Eleanor clung to him, her hands gripping his shirt. The world outside was a howling void of red chaos, but inside the small, dark cocoon of the blanket, it was intensely, shockingly intimate. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest. For hours, the storm raged. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. In the darkness, the barriers of race and society were eroded by the sheer necessity of survival. She was not a washerwoman, and he was not a savage. They were just two warm bodies huddled against the wrath of the earth. When the wind finally died down and the sand settled, they emerged looking like statues carved from red clay. Eleanor shook the dust from her hair. Coughing, Taji stood and shook out the blanket. They looked at each other. Eleanor's face was coated in red dust, her eyelashes thick with it, making the blue of her eyes startle him. Taji, too, was covered, his dark hair powdered red. For the first time, Taji offered her a hand to help her up. It was a small gesture, but it bridged a gap that had been miles wide the night before. "We must move," he said. "The wind covers our tracks, but it also slows us. We are close to the Dineta, the land of the people." The ride that day was grueling. The sun returned with a vengeance, baking the wet sand into a hard crust. They climbed out of the lowlands and up onto the high mesas, where the air was thin and smelled of pine resin. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of a hidden valley. Below them, nestled near a winding creek that flashed silver in the sun, was a cluster of hogans, traditional Navajo dwellings made of logs and packed earth. Smoke drifted lazily from the smoke holes. Sheep and goats grazed on the sparse grass. As they descended the trail, a rider appeared from the trees to intercept them. It was a woman, young and fierce, riding a pony with no saddle. She held a rifle across her lap with an ease that made Eleanor swallow hard. "Taji!" the woman called out in the Navajo tongue, her eyes darting instantly to Eleanor. The look she gave the white woman was one of pure, unadulterated hostility. "Atsa!" Taji greeted her, slowing his horse. "Put the gun down? She is with me." Atsa, Taji's younger sister, did not lower the rifle. She switched to broken English, clearly for Eleanor's benefit. "You bring a ghost to our fire. The soldiers are looking for us. Brother, and you bring one of them here." "She saved me," Taji said simply. "And she carries the paper that speaks of the explosion." Atsa spat on the ground. The dust puffed up in a small cloud. "White papers. White lies. She will bring death." "She stays," Taji said. His voice was not loud, but it had the finality of a stone falling into a well. They rode past Atsa, who watched them with eyes narrowed to slits, and entered the camp. The settlement was small, perhaps 5 families who had refused to move to the reservation boundaries. People stopped their work to stare. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, peeking out at the strange white woman with the dusty face. Taji led Eleanor to a hogan set slightly apart from the others. An old woman sat outside, weaving a rug on a vertical loom. Her face was a map of wrinkles, etched deep by 80 years of sun and wind, but her hands were nimble and strong. This was Kiyazi, the matriarch. Taji dismounted and helped Eleanor down. He spoke to his grandmother in their language, his tone respectful and low. He gestured to Eleanor, then to the saddlebag where the ledger was hidden. Kiyazi listened, her black eyes fixed on Eleanor. She did not smile, she did not frown. She merely observed, as a hawk observes a mouse. Finally, the old woman spoke in English, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over rock. "The white men want the canyon," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "They want the gold inside it," Eleanor answered, feeling the need to speak the truth. "They plan to destroy it." Kiyaze nodded slowly. "They eat the earth. They are never full." She looked Eleanor up and down, noting the torn dress, the blistered hands, the red dust. "You are not a soldier. You are not a wife. What are you?" I was a teacher," Eleanor said, "and a cook." "We have no books here," Kiyazi said sharply. "And we cook our own food. But if you stay, you do not sit. You eat, you work." "I am not afraid of work," Eleanor said, lifting her chin. Kiyazi let out a short, dry chuckle. "We shall see. You can sleep in the storage hogan. It is empty. But do not think you are a guest. You are a refugee." For the next week, Eleanor learned the true meaning of the word work. Life in the camp was a relentless cycle of survival. Before the sun rose, she was awake. Kiyazi handed her 2 heavy clay jars and pointed to the creek a mile away. The water was heavy, sloshing over the rim and soaking her dress as she hauled it back up the steep bank. Her shoulders ached with a fire that never seemed to dim. After the water came the corn. She sat for hours on a sheepskin, grinding dried kernels against a stone metate. The rhythm was monotonous, numbing. The stone bit into her palms, reopening the blisters that had just begun to heal. The young women of the tribe ignored her. The young men, however, were less kind. As Eleanor struggled to carry a bundle of firewood that was clearly too heavy for her, 2 young warriors walked past. They laughed, saying something in Navajo. "They say," Atsa's voice came from behind her, sharp and mocking, "that the white man's horse is strong, but his woman is weak. They call you old woman of the white ghosts." Eleanor dropped the wood. She stood there, her chest heaving, sweat stinging her eyes. The insult cut deeper than the physical pain. In Red Rock Crossing, she was too old to be a wife. Here, she was too old and too weak to be of use. She belonged nowhere. She was a piece of driftwood floating between 2 shores, wanted by neither. She looked at Atsa. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. But she remembered Boone's face. She remembered the laughter in the saloon. Without a word, Eleanor bent down. She grasped the bundle of wood. Her back screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and heaved it up. She walked past Atsa, her steps unsteady but determined, and threw the wood onto the pile by Kiyazi's fire, from the shadow of the horse corral. Taji watched. He had seen the young men mock her. He had seen his sister's cruelty. He had expected the white woman to break. He expected her to demand he take her back, or to collapse in tears. But she did not break. She was like the ironwood tree, gnarled, perhaps, and not as pretty as the willow, but impossible to kill. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of violet and orange, Tazi approached Eleanor. She was sitting by the creek, washing the dust from her arms. Her hands were raw, the skin peeling. "You carry the water wrong," he said. Eleanor looked up, startled. "I carry it as best I can." "You carry it with your shoulders," Tazi said. He crouched down beside her. "You must carry it with your legs and your back, like the earth carries the mountain." He picked up a jar. "Watch." He demonstrated the lift, the distribution of weight. Then he handed it to her. "Try." Eleanor tried. It was still heavy, but the strain on her neck lessened. "And your feet," Taji continued. "You walk like a soldier, heavy, stomping. You fight the ground." He pointed to her footprints in the mud. "Here, the ground is soft. You sink, walk flat, like the cat." He spent the next hour teaching her. He taught her how to step so she did not disturb the loose stones. He taught her how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. He did not offer pity. He offered skills. "Why are you teaching me?" Eleanor asked, wiping her brow. "Because a burden that cannot carry itself slows the whole tribe," Taji said, his face impassive. But then, for a brief second, his eyes softened. "And because you did not drop the wood today. My sister was wrong. You are not weak." Eleanor felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the exertion. It was the first time in years a man had looked at her with respect rather than assessment. While Eleanor learned the rhythm of the earth, back in Red Rock Crossing, the rhythm of industry had ground to a halt. Silas Boone stood in the wreckage of his private office. The map was ruined, stained with bourbon. But worse, the ledger, the damning book that detailed every bribe, every illegal land grab, every ounce of corruption was gone. Sheriff Cutler stood by the door, wringing his hat in his hands. He looked pale. "If that book gets to the governor," Cutler whispered, "or to the newspapers in the East." "It won't," Boone said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. He was not shouting today. The rage had crystallized into something colder, sharper. He walked to the window where the bullet hole had shattered the frame. He looked out at the desert, the vast, empty space that dared to defy him. "She took it," Boone said. "Eleanor Pike, the washerwoman, the barren cow." He turned to the sheriff. "She thinks she is a hero. She thinks she has escaped." Boone walked to his desk and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a heavy bag of gold coins and tossed it to Stryker, the gunman who was leaning against the wall, cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife. "Gather the men," Boone ordered. "Double the pay. We are not just clearing the canyon anymore." "What are the orders, boss?" Stryker asked, catching the bag. "Find the Navajo," Boone said. "Burn their crops, kill their sheep, and find the woman." He paused, his eyes gleaming with a malice that was almost tangible. "Do not kill her right away," Boone said softly. "Bring her back. I want the whole town to see what happens to a woman who forgets her place. I want to make an example of her. And then, when she has watched us blow that canyon to hell, when she sees that she can stop nothing, then you can kill her." The conflict had shifted. It was no longer just about a railroad or a mine. It was a hunt. And in the high desert, under the watching stars, the hunter was preparing to unleash hell upon the prey. Days turned into weeks, grinding away the softness of Eleanor Pike's former life like sandstone against a river current. The camp of the dying became her world. A world defined not by the ticking of a clock or the schedule of trains, but by the position of the sun and the needs of the sheep. Her hands, once stained with chalk and ink, were now permanently etched with the red dust of the high desert. Calluses formed over the blisters on her palms, turning into hard, protective pads. She learned the rhythm of the loom from Ki Yazi, though her fingers were clumsy compared to the old woman's fluid grace. She learned to distinguish the cry of a hawk from the call of a buzzard. And she learned that water was not something one simply turned a tap to receive. It was a heavy, precious weight that had to be carried on a straight back. Slowly, the wall of language began to crumble. She picked up words to for water, ga for rabbit, shai for me. The children were the first to let her in. A little girl named Najoni, no older than 5, had approached Eleanor one afternoon while she was shelling corn. Najoni had held out a small, smooth pebble of turquoise. Eleanor had smiled, the skin around her eyes crinkling, and accepted the gift. From that day on, the children would gather around her when the work was done, giggling as she tried to pronounce their names, their laughter a bright sound in the hard landscape. Yet, acceptance was a fragile thing. For every smile from a child, there was a cold shoulder from an adult. The suspicion that she was a spy for Silas Boone lingered like smoke in a room with no windows. Atsa, Taji's sister, watched Eleanor with the eyes of a hawk guarding a nest. Whenever Eleanor walked to the edge of the camp to look south toward the invisible line of the railroad, the warriors would stop their conversation, their hands drifting toward their knives. But the cruelest cuts did not come from fear of betrayal. They came from the same source that had driven her from Red Rock Crossing. One afternoon, while Eleanor was scrubbing clothes in the creek, two young women from a neighboring family group came down to the water. They did not see Eleanor hidden behind the reeds. They were laughing, talking about a young warrior who had brought a deer to camp. Then, the conversation shifted. "Taji keeps the white woman close," one said, wringing out a tunic. "For now," the other replied with a sneer. "Winter is coming. A man needs warmth. But when the spring comes, he will want a wife, not a grandmother." "She is dry," the first one laughed, a harsh sound. "My mother says she has the hips of a boy and the face of a dried apple. Tazi is a warrior. He will tire of a field that grows no corn." Eleanor sat frozen in the mud. The cold water soaking her skirt suddenly felt freezing. Dried apple. Field that grows no corn. The insults were different in language, but the meaning was identical to Boone's. The world, it seemed, agreed on one thing: a woman without youth, a woman without a child, was a vessel without purpose. She waited until they left before she emerged, her face burning with the shame she thought she had left behind in the saloon. She scrubbed the clothes until her knuckles bled, trying to wash away the words. That night, the temperature plummeted. The wind came down from the peaks, carrying the scent of snow that had fallen on the high mountains to the north. The tribe gathered close around the central fire, the drums beating a low, steady rhythm that sounded like the heartbeat of the earth. Eleanor could not sit with them. The laughter of the young women by the creek rang in her ears. She felt like a ghost, haunting a feast she could not taste. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and walked away from the firelight, toward the edge of the canyon. This was the precipice overlooking the deep, shadowy throat of the earth that Boone intended to shatter. Above her, the Milky Way was a river of crushed diamonds spilled across black velvet. It was beautiful, but it was vast and indifferent. Under that sky, Eleanor felt small. She felt the weight of her 34 years pressing down on her chest. She sat on a flat rock, hugging her knees, shivering as the wind cut through her thin layers. "The cold takes those who sit alone," a voice said from the darkness. Eleanor jumped, her hand going to her throat. Taji Nez stepped out of the shadows. He had been on patrol, watching the southern approach. He carried his rifle easily in one hand, but his eyes were on her. He saw the way she shivered. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy wool blanket he wore over his shoulder. He sat down beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He swung the blanket out and around, draping it over her shoulders so that they were both cocooned within its folds. The distance between them vanished. In the darkness beneath the wool, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. "You left the fire," Taji said. His voice was low, a rumble in his chest that she could feel as much as hear. "The fire is for the family," Eleanor whispered, staring out at the abyss of the canyon. I am just the guest who stayed too long." "You work harder than the young men," Tazi observed. "Ki Yazi says your hands are learning the loom. The children follow you like ducklings." "And the women say I am a dry field," Eleanor blurted out. The words tore out of her before she could stop them. The wound was open now, bleeding into the night. Tazi went still. He did not deny it. He did not offer empty platitudes. He waited. Eleanor turned to him. In the starlight, his face was a landscape of shadows and plains, unreadable and ancient. "They are right. Taji," she said, her voice trembling. "My husband died 3 years ago. We tried for 5 years before that. No child ever came. The doctor said—" She choked on the memory of the cold. Clinical voice of Dr. Evans. "He said the fault was mine. He said I was barren." She looked down at her hands, the hands that everyone said were too old, too rough. Silas Boone was cruel, but he was not lying, she confessed, the tears finally spilling over, hot tracks on her cold cheeks. They say I am too old, too used, too barren, too late for anything worth wanting. I am just a shell. Taji, why are you risking your life to protect a shell? She waited for him to pull away. She waited for the disgust, or the pity, which was worse. Taji looked at her. He looked at the tears shining on her face, at the lines of grief and exhaustion etched around her eyes. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, with a thumb rough as sandpaper. He wiped the tear from her cheek. He did not pull his hand away. He cupped her face, his palm warm against her skin. The earth does not judge the stone by how smooth it is, Tazi whispered. His voice was not the voice of a warrior now. It was the voice of a man who had seen the world break and rebuild itself 1,000 times. Gold, he said softly. The white men chase the dust in the river. It is easy to find. It shines for a moment and washes away. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. But the deep gold, Taji said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stopped her breath. The gold that holds the mountain together, it is born in the dark. It is pressed by the weight of the whole world. It is burned by the fire of the earth. He ran his thumb over the fine wrinkles at the corner of her eye. The rarest gold comes through fire, he whispered. You have been through the fire, Eleanor. You are not empty. You are solid. You are rare. Eleanor stopped breathing. The words settled into the hollow places of her heart, filling them with a warmth that was terrifying and wonderful. He did not see a barren woman. He saw a survivor. She looked at his mouth. It was a stern mouth, usually set in a hard line, but now it was softened by the proximity. Taji, she breathed. He gave her time. He held her gaze, letting her see him, letting her see that he was not offering charity. He was offering a partnership. He tilted his head slightly, a question asked in silence. Eleanor closed the distance. The kiss was slow. It was not the desperate, fumbling collision of youth. It was the meeting of two people who had walked long, lonely roads to find each other. His lips were chapped, tasting of the wind, but his touch was reverent. He kissed her as if she were something precious, something breakable that he would die to protect. Eleanor's hands found their way to his chest, gripping the rough fabric of his shirt. A sound escaped her throat, a sob of relief and longing. She opened to him, and the kiss deepened, becoming a fierce affirmation of life in the face of the vast, cold death of the desert. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her into the shelter of his body. For the first time in her life, Eleanor did not feel like a tool to be used or a failure to be discarded. She felt chosen. They did not speak when the kiss ended. There were no words left that were big enough. Tazi stood up, pulling her with him. He kept the blanket wrapped around her. He led her away from the canyon edge, away from the cold wind, toward his hogan. Inside, the air was still and warm. The fire in the center pit had burned down to glowing coals. He laid the sheepskins out on the earthen floor. That night, they lay side by side. It was not a night of wild, frantic lust. It was something deeper. Taji held her against him, his arm heavy and protective over her waist. Eleanor turned into him, fitting her body against his. In the darkness, his hand found hers. He interlaced their fingers. His skin was rough, hers was scarred, but together, the fit was perfect. She listened to the sound of his breathing, which matched the rhythm of the wind outside. She felt the beat of his heart against her back. She realized, with a clarity that was sharp as crystal, that she had never been truly loved before. She had been owned. She had been a wife, but she had never been seen. As she drifted into sleep, the shame of the barren field dissolved. She was the gold in the fire, and she was held. But peace in the territory was a fleeting ghost, usually vanishing with the dawn. Eleanor was woken by a sound that did not belong to the morning. It was not the crow of a rooster or the bleat of a sheep. It was the sharp, crack hiss of a signal flare. She sat up, clutching the sheepskin to her chest. The hogun was gray with the early light. Taji was already moving. He was pulling on his boots, his face a mask of grim focus. He grabbed his rifle and his bandolier. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice tight. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, scrambling to her knees. "Boone," Taji said. "They found us." He kicked open the door of the wooden hogan and rolled out, staying low. Outside, chaos had erupted. The morning sky was streaked with the red smoke of the flare. From the ridge overlooking the camp, gunfire began to rain down. It was the heavy, booming report of Buffalo Rifle's long range, deadly. Eleanor crawled to the door. She saw women screaming, grabbing their children and running toward the trees. She saw Ki Yazai standing by her loom, shouting orders, her old voice surprisingly strong. A bullet struck the dirt 3 feet from the hogan, spraying Eleanor with earth. She looked for Taji. He was running toward the corral, trying to cut the horses loose before they were slaughtered in the pen. He was moving in a zigzag pattern, drawing the fire away from the families. "Taji!" she screamed. She saw a puff of smoke from the ridge. Taji spun around, the impact of a bullet spinning him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, clutching his left shoulder. "No!" Eleanor scrambled out of the hogan. She did not run to him. She knew, with a sudden, icy logic, that running to him would get them both killed. She looked around. Taji's spare rifle, an old Winchester repeater, was leaning against the wall of the hogan. She grabbed it. It was heavy, smelling of gun oil. She checked the chamber. Loaded. She looked toward the ridge. She could see the glint of sunlight on metal barrels. A group of 3 riders was charging down the slope, hooting and hollering, intending to overrun the camp while the snipers kept the heads down. Eleanor saw Atsa pinned down behind a water trough, her rifle jammed. 2 children were cowering behind her. Exposed, the riders were heading straight for them, sabers drawn. Eleanor Pike, the schoolteacher, the barren widow, did not hesitate. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder. She remembered what her husband had taught her about shooting coyotes that came for the chickens. Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't pull. She aimed at the lead rider. She fired. The kick of the rifle bruised her shoulder, but the lead rider's horse screamed and stumbled, throwing the man into the dust. The other 2 riders pulled up, shocked by the resistance coming from the old woman. Eleanor worked the lever action. Clack, clack, she fired again. Dust kicked up near the second rider's face. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice raw and unrecognizable. "Get away from them!" Taji, struggling to his knees, blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt, saw her. He saw the woman who had trembled in the cold now standing in the open. Firing a rifle with a face set in stone, the riders turned and retreated up the slope, realizing the camp was not as defenseless as they thought. The shooting from the ridge slowed, then stopped. It was a probe, a test of strength. They would be back, and next time, they would bring the dynamite. Silence fell over the camp, broken only by the crying of a child and the groans of the fallen rider. Eleanor lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking now, uncontrollably. She ran to Taji. He was sitting up, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder, painful, bloody, but not fatal. "You shot him!" Taji rasped, looking at her with wide eyes. "I missed the man," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "I hit the horse. I am sorry for the horse." Atsa came running over. She looked at her brother's wound. Then she looked at Eleanor. There was no sneer on her face now. There was shock. "The location is lost," Atsa said, her voice tight. "They know exactly where we are. They will bring the cannon. They will bring the army." Ki Yazai hobbled over, leaning on her stick. She looked at the red smoke still drifting in the sky. "We must move," the old woman said. "To the high caves, now!" Eleanor tore a strip from her petticoat and began to bind Tazi's wound. She pulled the knot tight, ignoring his grunt of pain. "We cannot just run," Eleanor said, her voice hard. She looked at Taji. If we run, they blow the canyon. They win. We are few, Taji said, gritting his teeth. They are many? Then we must be smarter, Eleanor said. She looked at the blood on her hands, Taji's blood. The fire that Taji had spoken of was no longer a metaphor. It was here, consuming their world. She looked south toward where Boone was waiting. The fear was gone, burned away by the gold in the fire. I know how Boone thinks, Eleanor said. I know what he fears. We don't run. Taji, we fight. The rising action had reached its peak. The quiet days of learning and healing were over. Now, there was only the desperate defense of the earth and each other. The silence in the camp following the raid was heavier than the gunfire had been. It was a silence made of suspicion, broken only by the low mourning of a mother whose son had taken a bullet to the leg, and the crackle of the dying fires. Eleanor sat near the entrance of the healing hogan, watching Ki Yaze tend to Tazi's shoulder. The bullet had torn through the muscle, missing the bone by a fraction of an inch, but the blood loss had been significant. Taji lay on the sheepskins, his face pale beneath the bronze of his skin, his eyes closed in uneasy rest. Outside, the whispers were growing louder. They drifted on the wind like poisonous spores. She brought them here, a young warrior muttered, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The White Witch! Boone followed her scent. My brother bleeds because of her, Atsa said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of grief and anger. She stood by the water trough, glaring at Eleanor. If she stays, we all die. The spider rock will fall, and the spirits will curse us. Ki Yaze emerged from the hogan, leaning heavily on her staff. She looked at the dissenters, her eyes fierce. Silence, she commanded. She fought. She stood when you ran. The spirits judge the heart, not the skin. But Eleanor saw the looks. She saw the fear in the eyes of the mothers clutching their children. She saw the doubt even in the eyes of those who had begun to accept her. Ki Yaze could command their obedience, but she could not command their trust. Eleanor looked back at Taji. He shifted in his sleep, a groan escaping his lips. He was a leader, a bridge between the worlds. By keeping her here, he was cracking the foundation of his own authority. He was choosing her over the safety of his people, and that choice would eventually destroy him. She loved him too much to let that happen. The decision settled over her like a cold shroud. It was not a sudden impulse, but a quiet, heartbreaking certainty. She waited until the moon was high and the camp had settled into an exhausted, fitful sleep. The guard at the perimeter was dozing, worn out by the day's adrenaline. Eleanor crept into the hogan one last time. The air smelled of sage poultice and wood smoke. She knelt beside Taji. He looked younger in his sleep. The hard lines of the warrior smoothed away. She wanted to touch his face, to memorize the texture of his skin, but she dared not wake him. She took a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and a scrap of tanned leather that had been used for wrapping tools. Her hand shook as she wrote, the letters jagged and dark. Taji, I am the reason the fire comes to your door. I will not let it burn your house down. I am taking the book and the map to Boone. I will trade my life for your valley. You showed me that I am still worth something. Do not let the fire consume your family because of me. Yours, Eleanor. She placed the leather scrap on the blanket over his chest, where his hand would find it the moment he moved. She placed the heavy ledger and the map in her satchel. She slipped out into the night. She moved to the corral, her movements practiced now, silent as a cat. She chose the roan mare, a sturdy horse with good endurance. She did not saddle it, fearing the noise. She led it slowly away from the camp, walking for a mile over the hard rock to hide the sound of hooves, before she mounted and turned the horse south, toward the canyon, toward Boone, toward the end. Taji woke with the sunrise. The pain in his shoulder was a dull throb, but his instincts were screaming. He reached out, his hand seeking the warmth that should have been beside him. He found only empty wool and a piece of leather. He sat up, ignoring the flare of agony in his wound. He read the charcoal scrawl once, then twice. The words hit him harder than the bullet had. She had gone to sacrifice herself. She thought she was a burden to be removed, a bargaining chip to be played. "Foolish woman," he growled, the sound ripping from his throat. "Brave, foolish woman." He staggered to his feet. Ki-Yazi entered the hogan with a bowl of corn mush. She saw the empty bed, the note in his hand, and the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had worn years ago when the soldiers took his father. "She is gone," Ki-Yazi said quietly. "She goes to Boone," Taji said, grabbing his bandolier. "She thinks she can trade the book for our lives. Boone does not trade," Ki-Yazi said. "He takes—" "I know." Taji pulled his knife belt tight. "I am going after her. You are wounded," the old woman warned. "The storm is coming. The sky is turning black in the south. Then I will ride through the storm," Taji said. He looked at his grandmother, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "She said she was too old. She said she was nothing. I told her the gold comes through fire. I will not let the fire take her now." He did not wait for permission. He did not wait for the warriors. He ran to the corral, caught his black stallion, and swung onto its back in one fluid motion that defied his injury. He kicked the horse into a gallop, tearing out of the valley as the first peals of thunder rolled across the desert. Eleanor reached the ruins of the Spanish mission near the mouth of the Canyon of Red Echoes just as the storm broke. The sky was a bruised purple, and lightning forked violently, striking the mesas with blinding flashes. The mission was a skeleton of adobe and timber, abandoned 50 years ago. Now, it was swarming with men. Tents were pitched in the courtyard. Boxes of dynamite were stacked near the crumbling altar. She rode straight into the center of the camp. "Hold fire!" a voice shouted. Men scrambled for their rifles, but they paused when they saw a lone woman on a horse, her hands raised. Eleanor slid from the horse. Her legs were trembling, but she forced herself to stand tall. She held the ledger high in the air. "I am here to see Silas Boone," she shouted over the rising wind. "I have his property." The door to the rectory opened. Silas Boone stepped out. He was dressed in a long duster coat, a cigar clamped in his teeth. He looked at her, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a wolf that has ceased to hunt and is ready to eat. "Well, well," Boone said, walking toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "The prodigal washerwoman returns." "I have the book," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "And the map. I will give them to you. In exchange, you leave the Navajo alone. You leave the canyon." Boone laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that was swallowed by the thunder. "You want a bargain, you a thief, a traitor." He snatched the ledger from her hand. He didn't even check it. He handed it to Sheriff Cutler, who was standing behind him, looking pale and sick. "Burn it," Boone ordered. "But the deal," Eleanor stammered. "There is no deal." "Eleanor," Boone said, stepping closer. He grabbed her by the jaw, his fingers digging into her skin. "Did you really think I cared about the book I own the judges? I own the governor. That book was an inconvenience. You are the problem." He shoved her back. Two of his men, rough mercenaries with callous eyes, grabbed her arms. "Tie her to the post inside," Boone commanded. "We set the charges in 1 hour." "You can't," Eleanor screamed as they dragged her into the ruined chapel. "You promised. You said you wanted a wife. A legacy. You said I was just too old." Boone followed them inside. The chapel was roofless in places, the rain beginning to splatter against the stone floor. He signaled the men to tie her to the heavy wooden pillar that once supported the choir loft. When she was bound, Boone stood before her. He took the cigar from his mouth and studied her face. "You never understood, did you?" Boone said softly. "Why I kept you around all those years, why I promised you marriage but never gave you a ring." Eleanor stared at him, breathing hard. "It wasn't because you were old, Eleanor," Boone said, leaning in close, his breath smelling of tobacco and rot. "And it wasn't because you were barren." He chuckled darkly. "Do you remember Dr. Evans, the man who told you your womb was dried up? Who told you that you could never give a man a son? He examined me, Eleanor whispered. He examined the $500 I put in his pocket, Boone sneered. You were never barren? Eleanor, you were perfectly healthy. I paid him to tell you that. I paid him to crush your hope. The world seemed to stop. The thunder faded. Eleanor felt a ringing in her ears that was louder than the storm. Why? She gasped. Why would you do that? Because a woman who thinks she is broken is grateful for any scrap of attention. Boone hissed. I wanted you desperate. I wanted you to think no other man would ever want you. I wanted you to wait for me, to serve me, to be my safe harbor while I built my empire. And it worked. For years, you were my faithful dog. He stepped back, disgusted. But then you ran off with that savage. You found a spine. And that, my dear Eleanor, is why you have to die. Not because you are old, but because you are no longer mine. A rage, pure and white-hot, exploded in Eleanor's chest. It was not the passive grief she had carried for years. It was the fury of a life stolen. He had taken her motherhood. He had taken her self-worth. He had built a cage of lies and kept her in it. You are a monster, she spat at him. I'm a businessman, Boone corrected. He turned to the door. Set the charges, double the load. I want that canyon sealed before noon. Boone! A shout came from outside. It was a sentry. Rider coming fast. Boone pulled his revolver. Is it the army? No, sir, it's an Indian just won. Eleanor's heart leaped. Taji! He came. Boone smiled, checking the cylinder of his gun. Perfect. I will kill him in front of you. Eleanor. And then I will blow his ancestors to dust. He walked out into the courtyard. Taji Nez rode out of the storm like a spirit of vengeance. His horse was foaming, his black hair whipping in the wind. He did not slow down. He rode straight for the line of mercenaries. Fire! Boone screamed. Gunshots cracked through the air. Taji threw himself off the side of his horse, using the animal as a shield as he fired his Winchester from under the horse's neck. 2 mercenaries fell. The horse crashed into the line of crates, sending men scattering. Taji rolled, coming up with his knife in one hand and his rifle in the other. He was a whirlwind of violence. He was not fighting for territory. He was fighting for Eleanor. Sheriff Cutler stood by the dynamite, a torch in his hand. He watched the carnage. He watched Boone shoot a young mercenary who tried to run away. Tom, Boone yelled at the sheriff. Light the fuse. Blow it now. Cutler looked at the fuse. It ran toward the massive stack of dynamite crates positioned at the base of the canyon wall. Then he looked at the chapel, where he knew Eleanor was tied up. He looked at the Navajo warrior fighting 3 men with the desperation of a man possessed. Light it, you coward, Boone roared. Cutler's hand shook. He looked at Boone. There's a woman in there, Silas, and this ain't right. It was never right. Boone turned his gun on the sheriff. I said light it. Bang! Boone fired. The bullet took Cutler in the shoulder, spinning him around. The torch flew from his hand and landed in a puddle. Useless fool, Boone snarled. He grabbed a box of matches from his pocket and ran toward the fuse himself. Inside the chapel, Eleanor heard the shot. She heard Taze shouting her name. She pulled against the ropes. Her wrists were raw, bleeding. The knot was tight, but Boone had made a mistake. He had tied her to the pillar where the old iron candle sconces were rusted and jagged. She twisted her body, sawing the rope against the sharp, rusty metal edge of the sconce. The iron bit into her skin, cutting her arm, but she didn't feel it. She felt only the fire. Rarest gold comes through fire. The rope frayed. 1 strand, 2 strands. Outside, Taji was surrounded. His rifle was empty. He was fighting with his knife, parrying the bayonet of a mercenary. He saw Boone running for the fuse. Eleanor, Taji screamed, slashing the mercenary's leg and diving toward Boone. Boone turned and fired. The bullet grazed Tazi's ribs, knocking him backward into the mud. Boone struck a match. He shielded it from the rain. He touched it to the fuse. The sparks hissed and began to race toward the dynamite 300 pounds of explosives stacked against the cliff face. It is done! Boone screamed, laughing maniacally at the fallen warrior. The future wins! The chapel door crashed open. Eleanor Pike did not run away. She ran out. Her dress was torn, her arms bleeding, her hair wild. She saw Tazi on the ground. She saw the fuse burning a hissing snake of fire racing toward the cliff. She saw the dynamite. It was stacked on a mining cart, ready to be rolled into the final position. She looked at the cliff. Then she looked at the railroad tracks that ran parallel to the canyon wall, the tracks Boone had built, the symbol of his power. "No!" Eleanor screamed. She sprinted, not toward Taji, not toward safety. She ran toward the mining cart. "Stop her!" Boone yelled, raising his gun. Taji, seeing what she intended, threw his knife. It spiraled through the air and embedded itself in Boone's forearm. Boone dropped his gun, howling in pain. Eleanor reached the cart. The fuse was 10 feet away from the detonator caps. 10 seconds. She didn't try to extinguish it. The rain wasn't stopping it. She threw her shoulder against the heavy wooden cart. "Eleanor, get back!" Taji shouted, scrambling to his feet. "For the valley!" Eleanor screamed. She pushed. She dug her feet into the mud. All the strength she had built carrying water, grinding corn, and enduring 34 years of being told she was weak, she poured it all into this moment. The cart creaked. It moved. She didn't push it away from the cliff. She pushed it down the slight incline, toward the deep trench where the railroad foundations were laid, toward the spot where Boone was standing, clutching his arm. Boone's eyes went wide. The cart was rolling toward him, gaining speed. The fuse was sizzling mere inches from the box. "You crazy bitch!" Boone shrieked, scrambling backward, slipping in the mud. Eleanor let go of the cart and turned. She saw Tazi running toward her. "Run!" she yelled at him. The cart hit the depression in the ground, right next to the support beams of the railroad trestle, directly above where Boone had fallen. The fuse hit the cap. The world turned white. There was no sound at first, only a pressure wave that slammed into Eleanor like the fist of God. It lifted her off her feet and threw her backward. Then came the roar. It was a sound that shattered the sky. The earth heaved. The dynamite detonated. But because Eleanor had moved the cart, the force didn't shear the canyon wall. Instead, it blew downward and outward. It pulverized the railroad trestle. It collapsed the ground where Silas Boone lay, burying him instantly under tons of timber, iron, and rock. The shockwave rolled over the chapel, over the mercenaries who were covering their heads, and over Tazi, who had dived forward to shield Eleanor's body with his own just as the blast hit. Debris rained down splinters of wood, chunks of rock, twisted metal. A dark cloud of dust and smoke mushroomed into the storm clouds, turning the day into midnight. Then, silence. Slowly, the dust began to settle, mixed with the rain that was now falling softly, like tears on a grave. The mercenaries, those who were still alive, fled. Their paymaster was dead, their leader buried. The fight had gone out of them. Sheriff Cutler, clutching his bleeding shoulder, sat up against a rock. He looked at the crater where the railroad tracks used to be. He looked at the canyon wall, which still stood, scarred but unbroken. "She did it," Cutler whispered. "God save her soul." "She did it." In the center of the devastation, a mound of red earth moved. Taji Nez pushed himself up. His ears were ringing. He was covered in ash and mud. He looked frantically beneath him. Eleanor lay still. Her face was pale, streaked with soot. A trickle of blood ran from her nose. She was not moving. "Eleanor!" Tazi's voice was a broken rasp. He gathered her into his arms, rocking her. "Eleanor, open your eyes." He checked for a breath. It was there, but it was shallow, terrified, and weak. The blast had concussed her badly. "You are the gold," Taji whispered, pressing his forehead to hers, ignoring the rain and the pain in his own body. "Do not break now. You are the gold." He lifted her. She was a dead weight in his arms. He looked at the canyon that still stood. He looked at the railroad that was destroyed. The climax had passed. The explosion had reshaped the land. But it remained to be seen if the woman who caused it would survive to see the new world she had forged. The dust did not settle for 3 days. It hung over the canyon of red echoes like a funeral shroud, a thick haze of pulverized rock, gunpowder, and the splintered remains of ambition. The silence that followed the explosion was not the peaceful silence of the desert. It was the stunned, ringing silence of a battlefield where the earth itself had been wounded. The railroad trestle was gone. The intricate lattice of timber and iron that Silas Boone had willed into existence was now nothing more than twisted scrap metal and kindling lying at the bottom of the ravine. The canyon wall, the sacred throat of the Navajo ancestors, still stood, but it was changed. A massive scar of fresh, raw stone slashed across its face where the explosion had been diverted. The ancient red varnish of centuries was stripped away, leaving a jagged wound that looked like a scream frozen in rock. But the canyon had not fallen. The heart of the valley remained intact. The chaotic retreat of the railroad mercenaries had been swift, with Boone buried under tons of rock and their payroll likely buried with him. Loyalty evaporated like water on a hot skillet. They fled south, back toward the railhead, leaving the Navajo to reclaim the silence. Sheriff Tom Cutler, bleeding and pale, had not fled with them. Before vanishing into the vastness of the territory, he had done one final act of penance. He had retrieved the leather ledger from where it had fallen in the mud, the book Eleanor had risked her life to steal, and entrusted it to a circuit judge in the next county. The damning evidence of bribery and corruption was on its way to the governor. The investigation that would follow would tie up the mining company in legal battles for a decade, effectively ending the immediate threat to the land. But Eleanor knew none of this. She knew only darkness. And then, slowly, the smell of burning sage. She had been carried back to the camp on a travois dragged behind Tazi's horse, her body wrapped in wool blankets to stop the shivering that came from shock. Her dress was ruined. Her skin was scraped raw by the flying debris, and her head throbbed with a violence that made opening her eyes an agony she could not yet face. For 4 days and 4 nights, she drifted in the gray space between the living and the dead. In her fever dreams, she was back in the schoolhouse, writing on the blackboard, but the chalk kept crumbling into red dust. She saw her husband's face, then Silas Boone's face, laughing and calling her a barren field. She tried to scream, but her mouth was filled with sand. Then the sand would turn to water, cool, sweet water trickling past her cracked lips. "Drink," a voice would command. It was a low voice, rough like grinding stones, yet gentle. She would swallow, and the darkness would recede a fraction. Taji Nez did not leave her side. The warrior who had ridden into machine gun fire without blinking now sat cross-legged on the dirt floor of the healing hogan, his own wounded shoulder bound in fresh linen. He had traded his rifle for a gourd of water and a wet cloth. It was a strange and quiet reversal. Weeks ago, she had been the one tending to his scrapes, teaching him English words, trying to prove her worth through labor. Now, she was helpless, stripped of all agency, reduced to the fragile beat of her own heart, and he was the guardian. He wiped the soot from her forehead with a tenderness that confused the other men of the tribe. He sang to her low, rhythmic chants that spoke of the mountain, the lightning, and the spider-woman who wove the universe together. He was calling her spirit back, anchoring her to the earth with his voice. Outside the hogan, the camp was alive with murmurs. The explosion had been seen and felt for miles. The immediate threat was gone, but the fear remained. The white woman brought the fire. A man named Hosteen drifted near the entrance, his voice hushed but sharp. "Look at the canyon. It is scarred. She did this. The canyon stands." Kiyazi's voice snapped from her place by the fire. The matriarch looked older since the battle. The stress had deepened the canyons in her own face. If she had not moved the cart, the canyon would be gone. The spirits would have no home. Do not curse the hand that pulled you from the fire just because it is scorched. "She is Bilagana," the man argued. "She belongs to the town. The town tried to kill her," Kiyazi said, stirring the corn stew. "She belongs to the fire now, and the fire has not yet spit her out." On the 5th morning, the fever broke. Eleanor opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the roof of the hogan. the log spiraling upward to the smoke hole where a circle of blue sky was visible. The air smelled of cedar smoke and damp earth. She tried to move, and a groan escaped her lips. Every inch of her body felt bruised. "Stay still." Tazi was there. He leaned over her, his face haggard. He had not shaved, and a shadow of dark stubble covered his jaw. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. But when he saw her eyes focus, a light sparked in them that was brighter than the morning sun. "Taji," she whispered. Her voice was a wreck, a dry rasp. "I am here," he said. He lifted her head gently and held a cup of willow bark tea to her lips. "Drink. It stops the pain." Eleanor drank. The bitter taste was grounding. It told her she was alive. "Boone," she asked, the name tasting like ash. "Buried," Taji said simply. "The earth took him back." Eleanor closed her eyes, a shudder running through her. The image of the cart rolling, the blinding flash, the feeling of flying backward, it all came rushing back. "I killed him," she whispered. "I killed them." "You saved the valley," Taji corrected her. He took her hand. His calloused thumb rubbed her knuckles. "You saved Atsa. You saved Kiyazi. You saved me." I am broken, Taji," she said, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "Look at me. I was already old, and now—" "Hush," Taji said. He squeezed her hand. "Rest now. We talk when the sun is high." Later that day, a visitor came to the edge of the camp. It was not a soldier, but a lone rider on a weary horse. He did not enter the circle of hogans, but stood by the creek, waiting to be acknowledged. It was Tom Cutler. He was no longer wearing the tin star on his vest. His arm was in a sling. Taji went out to meet him. They spoke for a long time by the running water. There was no shouting, no posturing, just two men who had seen too much death standing in the aftermath. When Taji returned to the hogan, he carried a heavy canvas sack and a folded piece of paper. "The sheriff is leaving," Taji told Eleanor, who was sitting up now, leaning against a pile of sheepskins. "He goes to California. He says there is no law left in Red Rock Crossing, only ghosts." Taji placed the sack on the ground. It clinked heavily. "He left this $500 in gold. He said it was the bribe Boone paid him to look the other way." Taji paused. "He said it belongs to the widow Pike. He said it is blood money turned clean." He handed her the paper. Eleanor unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a letter, written on the back of a wanted poster, her wanted poster. "Mrs. Pike, I cannot fix what was done. I cannot give you back your years. But the town knows the truth now. I told them Boone lied about you. I told them you were the only one with a spine. You are not a criminal. Eleanor, you are the only innocent thing that ever walked through the Silver Spur. Don't come back. This town don't deserve you. T. Cutler." Eleanor lowered the paper. She looked at the bag of gold. $500. It was enough to buy a ticket to the east, enough to buy a small cottage in a city where no one knew her name, enough to start over as a respectable widow. "He says the town is quiet," Taji said, watching her face. "The women who laughed at you, they are silent. They know you stopped the railroad. They know you killed the wolf." "I don't care about them," Eleanor said softly. She pushed the bag of gold away. "I don't care if they hate me or hail me. They still don't know me." She looked at Taji. "Help me up. I need to see the light." "You are weak," Taji protested. "Help me up," she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of its old steel. Taji supported her. He wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders and half carried her out of the hogan. The sun was just rising over the eastern mesas. The light hit the canyon of red echoes at a low angle. Eleanor gasped. The canyon was indeed scarred. The blast had sheared away the dark, weathered patina of the rock face, exposing the raw stone beneath. But in the morning light, that raw stone was not ugly. It was a brilliant, vibrant orange gold. The cracks radiating from the blast site caught the sun and glowed as if the cliff itself were bleeding liquid light. It was a wound. Yes, but it was magnificent. The rarest gold comes through fire, Eleanor whispered, the words drifting back to her from that night by the fire. She turned to Taji. You were right. It is not destroyed. It is revealed. Taji nodded, looking at the cliff. The stone is cut, but the valley still breathes. The wind still sings in the cracks. The water still flows. A scar does not mean death. Eleanor, it means you survived. It means you are tougher than what tried to kill you. He turned his gaze to her. He looked at the bandage on her forehead, the scratches on her cheek, the gray in her hair that seemed to shine like silver in the sun. You have scars now, too, he said gently. Do they make you less? Eleanor touched her face. She felt the rough bandage. She felt the lines of her age. For the first time in her life. She did not wish them away. No, she said. They make me real. But reality brought with it the cold wind of practical necessity. That evening, the elders of the scattered Navajo families gathered. They sat in a circle near the central fire. Ki Yazi presided. Taji sat on one side, Eleanor on the other. The question was simple. What to do with the white woman? She has money now, one elder said, eyeing the canvas sack. She can go. She can live well among her own kind. Her own kind rejected her. Ki Yazi reminded them. And she rejected them to save us. But she is not dying, another argued. She does not know the songs. She cannot weave the rug of history. If she stays, she will always be a stranger. And if she marries Tazi, their children, if she could have them, would be half souls. The mention of children, the old ache, throbbed in Eleanor's chest. She looked at the ground. I cannot give Tazi children, she said, her voice clear in the silence. That part of my life, the doctor said it is closed. If staying means I must provide a lineage, then I must go. She looked at Taji. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. She loved him. She loved him with a depth that terrified her. But she would not be the stone that stopped his river from flowing. I will take the money, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. I will go. You should find a wife who can give you sons. Taji, someone young, someone whole. Taji stood up. The movement was sudden, angry. He stepped into the center of the circle, standing between Eleanor and the elders. Whole, he demanded. He pointed to the canyon wall in the distance. Is the canyon not whole because it is broken? Is the warrior not whole because he bleeds? He turned to Eleanor, ignoring the elders. I did not choose you because I wanted a broodmare, Taji said, his voice ringing with passion. I did not choose you because I wanted a servant. I chose you because you are the only one who runs toward the dynamite. He knelt before her, oblivious to the eyes of his people. I cannot choose for the tribe, Taji said. If they say you must go, then I cannot stop them. He paused, looking deep into her eyes. But I can choose my life. If you go, I go. We will live in the Badlands. We will live on the edge of the world. I would rather live in a cave with you than in a palace with a woman who does not know the smell of smoke. A silence stretched across the circle. The declaration was absolute. He was offering to exile himself for her. Eleanor wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of being valued. Ki Yaze struck her staff against the ground. Thud. The warrior speaks with the tongue of a fool, the old woman said, though her eyes were twinkling with a strange, fierce pride. But he speaks true. She looked at Eleanor. We do not need more children as much as we need teachers. Ki Yazi said, the world is changing. The iron snake is dead today, but another will come tomorrow. Our children need to know how to read the white man's paper so they are not cheated. They need to know how to speak the white man's tongue so they can fight with words when guns fail. Ki Yazi pointed a gnarled finger at Eleanor. You were a teacher. Be a teacher again. Not a white woman teaching us to be white, but a woman of the valley teaching us how to survive the storm. The elders murmured their assent. It was a pragmatic solution, but it was also an acceptance. You stay, Ki Yazi pronounced. Not as a guest, not just as a wife, but as part of the circle. Eleanor looked at Taji. He was smiling, a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I stay, Eleanor whispered. Later that night, Eleanor walked to the edge of the camp where her horse was tethered. She took the canvas sack of gold. She walked to the spot where the communal food stores were kept: the corn, the dried meat, the wool. She opened the sack. "What are you doing?" Tazi asked, coming up behind her. "I don't need $500, Eleanor said. "And I don't need a cottage in the east." She poured the gold coins into the communal basket. It was a fortune. It would buy sheep to replace those lost in the raid. It would buy blankets for the winter. It would buy rifles for defense. "This is not charity," she said, turning to him. "This is my share. If I am to eat from the pot, I put into the pot." Taji looked at the gold, then at her. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was solid, grounding. "You are a stubborn woman, Eleanor Pike," he murmured into her hair. "I am an old woman, Taji Nez," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "And old women know what matters." She looked out at the dark silhouette of the canyon. She was scarred. She was barren. She was 34 years old in a world that worshipped 16. She was a widow who had killed a man, and she had never been more whole. She had stepped out of the role society had written for her, the tragic, useless widow, and written her own lines. She had accepted the fire. She had accepted the scar. The falling action was over. The adrenaline had faded. What was left was something quieter, harder, and infinitely more precious. It was a life not of safety, but of choice, a life on the edge of the world, with the man who saw the gold in the dust. The dawn did not break over the canyon of red echoes with a shout, but with a whisper. The sky turned from the deep bruised purple of night to a soft, translucent lavender. And then, as the sun breached the eastern mesas, the world was flooded with a light so clear it seemed to scour the soul. On the rim of the canyon, not far from where the dynamite had scarred the rock face, a small circle of stones had been arranged. There were no pews, no altar, no stained glass. There was only the vast, indifferent sky and the red earth that had, days ago, threatened to consume them all. Eleanor Pike stood in the center of the circle. She wore a dress of soft deerskin, bleached white by the sun and the skill of the Navajo women. It was not the silk gown of a society bride, nor was it the frayed calico of a washerwoman. It was something new. Atsa, the woman who had once looked at Eleanor with eyes full of suspicion, now stood behind her. With hands that were surprisingly gentle, Atsa wove a strip of embroidered red cloth into Eleanor's hair. The red matched the canyon walls. It was the color of blood and earth, the color of life. "You stand tall," Atsa whispered, her voice rough but devoid of malice, "like the ironwood." Tazi Nez stood opposite Eleanor. He wore his finest shirt, clean and pressed, and a necklace of silver and turquoise that rested heavy against his chest. His arm was still in a sling, and he moved with the stiffness of a man whose body is healing. But his eyes were clear. He looked at Eleanor not as a prize he had won, nor as a burden he had saved, but as the other half of his own silence. Ki-Yazi, the matriarch, stepped forward. She held a bundle of burning sage, waving the fragrant smoke over them with an eagle feather. The scent was sharp and clean, cutting through the lingering smell of dust that still hung in the air from the explosion. "There is no priest here," Ki-Yazi said, her voice carrying on the wind. "The white god lives in a box of wood. The Dine god lives in the wind. Today, we ask the wind to tie you together." She looked at Tazi. "You are the mountain. You do not move." She looked at Eleanor. "You are the river. You cut through stone. Together," the old woman said, sprinkling yellow corn pollen on their shoulders. "You are the valley. You are the place where life grows." It was not a marriage by the laws of the territory. There was no paper signed, no license filed in a dusty courthouse. It was a promise made to the earth. Taji reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a gold band purchased from a catalog. He produced a ring he had hammered himself from a silver coin, rough and imperfect, etched with the symbol of a lightning bolt, the fire that changes the earth. He took Eleanor's hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused from the hoe and the loom, scarred from the rope and the iron sconce. He slid the ring onto her finger. "I cannot give you safety," Taji said, his voice low and steady. "The world will always try to break us. I cannot give you a house of brick, but I give you my fire. I give you my blood. As long as I stand, you do not stand alone." Eleanor looked at the silver ring. It caught the morning light, shining against her weathered skin. She reached into her sash and pulled out a string of juniper berries and turquoise beads she had strung herself. She placed it around his neck. "I do not want safety," Eleanor replied, her voice clear and strong. "I want the storm. I want the quiet. I want the man who saw gold when everyone else saw dust. I take you, Taji Nez. I take your people. I take your fight." They did not kiss with the polite restraint of the parlor. Taji stepped forward, bridging the gap, and pressed his forehead against hers. They breathed the same air, sharing the smoke of the sage and the chill of the morning. It was a moment of absolute connection, a grounding wire between two souls that had been drifting in the storm. "It is done," Kiyaji said, tapping her staff on the rock. "Now, we eat." The celebration was simple. There was roasted mutton, corn stew, and fry bread. There was laughter, a sound that had been absent from the valley for too long. For the first time, Eleanor sat in the inner circle, not as a guest, but as kin. In the months that followed, the seasons turned. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp gold of autumn, and the cottonwood trees along the creek bottom turned the color of flames. On a flat rise of land where the hidden trail from the valley met the old trade road, a building began to rise. It was not a hogan, nor was it a cabin. It was a blend of both thick adobe walls to keep out the heat, timber beams to support a high roof, and a wide porch that faced the rising sun. It was a trading post, but it was also a gate. Taji and Eleanor built it with their own hands, aided by the young men of the tribe who now looked at Eleanor with a mixture of awe and respect. They called it the Red Echo Post. It became a place of intersection. Traders moving north from the border stopped there to water their horses and trade coffee and sugar for the thick, waterproof wool blankets the Navajo women wove. For Eleanor, the post became her classroom. Every morning, before the sun was high enough to burn, a group of children would gather on the wide wooden planks of the porch. Most were Navajo little Najoni and her cousins, but there were others too. The children of drifting prospectors, the son of a trapper who lived in the hills, the daughter of a new homesteader. They sat cross-legged in a semicircle. Eleanor mounted a large piece of slate on the adobe wall. "A," she would say, drawing the letter in white chalk. "A is for apple. A is for Atsa. A is for arid." She taught them to read the treaties that men like Silas Boone tried to use against them. She taught them to count the weight of wool so they would never be cheated by a dishonest merchant. She taught them history, not just the history of presidents and generals, but the history of the land they stood on. Sometimes, she would stumble over a Navajo word. "It is dine," a voice would correct her from the doorway. Atsa would be standing there, leaning against the door frame with a basket of corn. "Not dine, the tongue must touch the teeth." "Thank you, Atsa," Eleanor would say, smiling. "Class, repeat after Atsa." The useless woman, the barren field, was now the gardener of the most precious crop in the territory, the minds of the next generation. She looked at the faces upturned toward her brown faces, white faces, all dusted with the same red earth, and she felt a fullness in her chest that no biological child could have surpassed. She was not raising one family. She was raising a community. Tazi found his new role as well. The dynamite had stopped the railroad, but it had not stopped the world. Surveyors still came. Men with tripods and maps still wandered the edges of the territory. Tazi did not shoot them. He rode out to meet them. He would sit on his horse, his Winchester in its scabbard but clearly visible, and he would speak to them in their own language. "This way is closed," he would say, pointing to the canyon. "The rock here is unstable. If you blast, you bury your prophet." Then he would point to the long way around, the route that skirted the sacred lands. "That way is hard, but the stone holds. Water is there. He became a guide, a mediator. He showed them that the land could be crossed without being broken. He earned a reputation not as a savage obstructionist, but as a man who knew the earth better than their engineers. The Indian agent from the government came once to threaten him, met Taji's steady gaze, drank Eleanor's coffee, and left with a report that the situation is stable and best left alone. Back in Red Rock Crossing, the town moved on, as towns do. The railroad eventually found another route, 50 miles to the east. The boom slowed down, but the story of Eleanor Pike refused to die, like all stories in the West. It stretched and changed shape in the telling. In the dim light of the Silver Spur, old miners would lean over their whiskey and whisper, "I saw her," one would say. "The White Witch. She called down lightning to blow the tracks." "Nah," another would argue. "She was mad. Crazy as a loon. The desert took her mind, and she ran off to marry a coyote spirit. I heard she was a spy." A third would chime in, working for the government to stop the gold rush. They painted her as a monster, a ghost, a cautionary tale for women who stepped out of line. But 20 miles away, in the deep silence of the valley, a different story was told. Around the winter fires, when the snow dusted the mesas, Kiyazi would gather the children. She was very old now, her skin like parchment, but her voice was strong. She would tell them of the time of the big noise. She would tell them of the woman who walked into the camp with bleeding feet and a book of lies. She was not of our blood, Kiyazi would say, but her heart was made of ironwood. She would tell them how the woman pushed the cart of fire, how she changed the path of death. "We gave her a name," the old woman would say. "Ola Tso Doka Sizi." "What does it mean, grandmother?" the children would ask. "It means..." Kiyazi would smile, her eyes finding Eleanor across the firelight. "The gold that survives the fire." Years passed, the century turned. 1900 came and went. The horses gave way to Model T Fords that rattled and coughed their way across the rough tracks of the desert. One late afternoon in 1910, a touring car filled with young people from the east sputtered to a halt in front of the Red Echo post. They were tourists, dressed in dusters and goggles, seeking the thrill of the Wild West before it vanished entirely. A young man jumped out, adjusting his cap. He looked at the sign above the door. "Red Echo," he read. He pointed to the jagged, lighter-colored scar on the canyon wall in the distance. "Look at that, Clara. That's where the explosion happened. The guidebook says a crazy woman blew up a railroad here 20 years ago." A young woman stepped out, shielding her eyes from the sun. "A woman? Don't be silly, George. It was probably a mining accident, or bandits." "No, really," George insisted, laughing. "The legend says she fell in love with a chief and they fought off a whole army. Romantic rot, if you ask me." They walked up the steps of the trading post. Sitting on a bench in the shade of the porch were an old man and an old woman. The man was striking, with long silver hair tied back and a face that looked like it had been carved from mahogany. He was whittling a piece of cedar. The woman beside him was frail, her hands gnarled with arthritis, her hair a halo of pure white. She was shelling peas into a wooden bowl. "Excuse me," George said loudly, assuming the old couple might be deaf or simple. "We need water for the radiator, and maybe some of those blankets." The old woman looked up. Her eyes were a startling, clear blue, the only thing about her that time had not faded. "The pump is round the back," she said. Her voice was soft, cultivated, with the faint, precise diction of a schoolteacher. "The blankets are inside. My daughter, Najoni, will help you." George blinked, surprised by her accent. "Oh, thank you. Ma'am?" He looked at the canyon again. "Say, you folks have lived here a long time. Do you know if the story is true about the explosion?" The old man stopped whittling. He looked at the boy with dark, amused eyes. "Many stories in the desert," the man said. "The wind blows them around." "Right," George chuckled. "Just a tall tale. Then, figures." He and Clara went inside. The old couple remained on the porch. The sun began to dip below the horizon, setting the sky on fire. The light hit the scar on the canyon wall, and for a few fleeting minutes, the raw stone glowed with a brilliant, blinding gold intensity. It was the most beautiful thing in the landscape. Eleanor stopped shelling the peas. She watched the light. She reached out and placed her hand on the man's knee. He covered her hand with his. The silver ring on her finger was worn smooth now. The lightning bolt almost rubbed away by years of work, but it still shone. "They think we are myth. Taji," Eleanor whispered, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let them," Taji Nez replied. "Myths live forever. People just die." He looked at her. He saw the map of their life etched into her face. He saw the grief, the joy, the hard winters, and the sweet springs. He saw the woman who had ridden into a sandstorm to save him. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. The warmth of the sun was fading, but the warmth between them was constant. "They once said I was too old," she murmured, the memory of that day in the square feeling like a lifetime ago. A bad dream she had finally woken from. Taji squeezed her hand. He looked at the golden scar on the cliff, then back at the white-haired woman who was his heart, his breath, and his home. "Then they never understood gold," he said softly. They sat in silence as the blue shadow of the earth rose up the canyon walls, extinguishing the fire of the day but leaving the heat in the stone. Narrator, and so, the story ends not with a gunshot, but with a whisper on a porch, in the vast mythology of the American West, where history is often written in blood and measured in bullets. The tale of Eleanor Pike and Taji Nez is a quiet anomaly. It is a reminder that the strongest things in the desert are not the rocks, nor the iron rails, nor the men who claim to own them. The strongest things are the seeds that wait for the rain, the roots that hold the soil, and the hearts that refuse to harden. Some say gold is the most precious metal because it does not rust. It does not tarnish. It endures. Eleanor Pike was told her value was gone. She was told her season had passed, but she proved that the human soul is not a commodity to be spent and discarded. It is a forge, and those who are willing to walk through the fire, to burn away the fear and the pretense, do not come out empty. They come out rare. They come out solid. They come out as gold that never breaks. Outro. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust, the pain, and the ultimate redemption of Eleanor and Taji. I hope their story touched something in you, as it did in me while telling it. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story from? Are you sitting on a porch at sunset, riding a train, or maybe just relaxing at home? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the ending. Did Eleanor make the right choice? If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button on this video. And if you really loved it, please give it a hype. Your support helps these stories reach more people and keeps the fire of the West burning. Thank you. And until the next campfire,